Hello, U.S. History students. Today we are starting Unit 6 on civil rights. We're going to start with Note 6.1 on the counterculture. Your essential question: what was the counterculture and why did they gain followers in the 1960s? So, starting out the decade in 1960, we had the election between JFK and Nixon. So, between Kennedy and Nixon, we had our first televised debate. So, this really gave us the opportunity to look at both candidates. And it was quoted that last night, image replaced the printed word as the national language of politics. So, how a presidential candidate looked really started to play into the election. In October of 1960, we had civil rights being challenged across the United States. So the police arrested Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. for conducting a sit in at a lunch counter. So a sit in means that they went to a lunch counter that only served white people, and they sat and they requested that they be served lunch. So, as a peaceful protest, they were simply asking for lunch and they were arrested. Dr. King was there and he was sentenced to 4 months in jail for sitting at a lunch counter for white patrons. So JFK and Nixon react pretty differently to this arrest. JFK actually called Dr. King's wife and his brother. He worked for Dr. King's release, whereas President Nixon kind of avoided this. This incident captured national attention, and the African American community would turn out and they would vote for JFK because of this event. So Kennedy, when he then became president, he he called for the end of poverty. He was trying to combat poverty in inner cities, and he had his brother Robert Kennedy investigate racial injustice in the South. He presented Congress with a civil rights bill and asked them to pass this bill, but unfortunately, as we know, President Kennedy would not see the passage of this Civil Rights Act because he was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. After he was assassinated, his vice president, Johnson, LBJ, would then become our next president, and he really pushed to pass the Civil Rights Act through Congress as a way to honor President Kennedy's legacy. So, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, national origin, and then it gave the federal government the power to enforce these laws. During this time, we had a lot of discrimination still happening, primarily in the South. Brown versus Board of Education was a Supreme Court case in 1955 that ended segregation in all schools, workplaces, and public facilities, but a lot of these places in the South were still widely segregated, even though this had passed in 1955. So the next year, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed by Congress and signed by Johnson. This was to ensure the voting rights for all Americans. It prohibited practices like literacy tests, which were tests that they would give to people when they were going to try to go vote or register to vote. Now, these literacy tests, they would be different based on your race. So if you were a white person, you would go and you would read something simple like a stop sign. If you were an African American person, they would give you a much more complicated piece of text like Shakespeare. You would have to read and interpret it. So the literacy tests were really just a way to suppress the African American vote. So this Voting Rights Act prevented any literacy tests as a voting requirement. It also ensured consistent election practices. It was aimed to make sure the 15th Amendment was followed, and it included the provision to eliminate poll taxes. So in the 60s, teens started rebelling against mainstream society. Remember, in the 50s, things were pretty clean cut. Like, you were supposed to follow rules, you're supposed to follow orders. But in the 60s, they started rebelling and fighting back against that. So youth began to blame their parents' generation for problems that their nation had faced. They did not like that they were growing up with the threat of nuclear war. They didn't like racial discrimination and segregation. They were opposed to the Vietnam War. So these kids had a lot of issues that were happening in American society that they wanted to fight back against. They started to question traditional values that they had been taught. They were challenging authority. They were living nonviolent lifestyles. They called the mainstream the establishment, and they were fighting back against the establishment. They wanted to create an alternative culture based on peace and love. So students began rebelling as well. Right here in the Bay Area at UC Berkeley, we had students who were rebelling against school policies that prohibited their free speech. So they had school policies that prevented students from being able to organize politically. And the students here at UC Berkeley, they really fought back and they started a free speech movement which swept across college campuses across the nation. Students used civil disobedience to protest injustices. In 1964, here in Berkeley, there was a lot of protests happening. It was the start of the free speech movement. So at UC Berkeley in the Bay Area is where they started all of this. This led to growing student activism across the nation. And it really shocked the mainstream America who expected young people not to question authority. You were supposed to listen to your parents, you're supposed to listen to teachers and the police. And these students were not doing that. They were pushing back against things that they thought were unjust. So, thousands of teens and young adults quit their jobs during this time. They left school to have a more freewheeling existence. They rejected materialism. They wanted to live this new life of counterculture against the mainstream. They started forming communities like communes. They would go and they would live in urban areas. They would create their own homes. They'd live off the land. They attempted to live in harmony with nature. They shared their property. They shared their food. Everything was together in a rural community where everyone was supposed to be treated equally. These people were typically called hippies. They try to enlighten themselves through new religions that they hadn't been exposed to before. These religions weren't new, but they were new to them. So, Eastern religions like Buddhism, they were practicing with. Others searched through astrology. Some started using drugs to try to expand their minds. And actually, using drugs was something that they studied in colleges as well. So there was a professor at Harvard who was studying the use of LSD as a way to open and expand your mind. So he was actually doing studies where he would have his students take these drugs so he could see what would happen to their brains. So 1967 became known as the Summer of Love. This was in San Francisco in the Haight Ashbury district. So if you ever go to San Francisco, you can still go to the Haight Ashbury district. It is very similar today to what it was back then. A lot of older hippies, um, people experimenting with these alternative lifestyles. So in the Haight-Ashbury in 1967, this was considered the summer of love. We had a generation of young people coming to the Bay Area. We had over 100,000 teens and young adults who abandoned their schools and their jobs, and they moved out here to California. But unfortunately, we did have a decline in the counterculture because of people who took advantage of these young people. So the hippies that sought all of these new freedoms, they often faced very serious problems. So when they were experimenting with these new drugs to expand their mind, that often led to drug addiction. And drug addiction can lead to increased rates of crime. If people feel that they need drugs to survive, they would have to commit crimes to be able to pay for them, oftentimes. A lot of them had no way or no means to support themselves, although they were fighting back against the capitalist system. You still have to be able to feed yourself and take care of yourself. So, unfortunately, that was very difficult for a lot of them. And some people, like Charles Manson here, this guy, he really took advantage of these young people and attracted sinister behavior. So, he led a cult this known as the Manson murders in 1969. This was sort of an end to the summer of love, an end to this whole idea of being this new freewheeling society. He really showed how some people can take advantage of it, how terrible it can turn out. But they did have quite a profound impact, the young people during the counterculture. Attitudes about sexual behavior loosened because of the art, because of what they pushed through. They experimented with new art. So we have very famous art, different music, different films. Andy Warhol was a famous painter during the time. We had all kinds of new art coming out of the counterculture movement. um, Rules on censorship did get relaxed, and the film industry now has a rating system because they decided that they wanted to not ban things that were considered sensitive subjects, but in fact just put a rating on it so people know. Music was vastly different during the 60s. A lot of artists started using their music as a way to push out a message. So they started using like rock and roll to influence young people, to get people engaged politically, to get them to fight back against what they saw as oppression. So the Beatles were a very famous group at the time. Bob Dylan wrote very political songs. Woodstock was during the 60s. We had a lot of young artists like Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, who were very political in their nature. We are going to actually do a project on protest songs tomorrow, so I'm going to ask you all to look around for some protest songs tonight for your homework to come up with one for our project tomorrow, because we still have lots of protest music today. All right, so we're switching gears here to President Nixon. President Nixon, remember, would become president after LBJ did not run for reelection. So we have President Nixon winning the 1968 election. So we have the end of the 1960s here with him. We have a shift to more conservative American politics. So we had all of this radical change in the 60s, but we had a lot of older people who were pushing back against these young people who wanted to change the entire society. So Nixon's campaign said that he was working for the silent majority. So those Americans who pay taxes, but they don't go out and they protest, they don't demonstrate, and he wanted to restore law and order to our nation. So, as we know, the Vietnam War was going on during this time. The Vietnam War was happening from the 50s till 1975. And the information that was coming from the government about the Vietnam War was things were going great, we were winning the war, everything was fantastic. But our reporters over there were showing us kind of a different story. This guy here, Daniel Ellsberg, he leaked classified assessments of the Vietnam War in 1971. This was a 7,000 page document, and it became known as the Pentagon Papers. He released these government filings to the New York Times and the Washington Post, and he let them publish these Pentagon Papers. The Nixon administration sued both the New York Times and the Washington Post to prevent them from being able to publish any of this information, but the Supreme Court ruled that the papers could continue to publish their documents. After the release of these papers, the White House created a group to ensure internal security. They became known as the Plumbers because they stopped leaks coming out of the White House. So in 1971, they burglarized the office of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist, and they were trying to make him seem like he was not mentally stable to discredit him. Nixon's domestic advisor approved of this plan, so Nixon's people knew what they were doing. And then when he was running for re-election in 1972, the Plumbers then turned their activities to political espionage. So these five men went into the Democratic Party's national headquarters. They broke in and they were trying to take information from the Democrats who were running against them at the time. These five men were arrested on June 17th of 1972. They were wiretapping, they were bugging the headquarters, so they were wiretapping all the phone lines so they could record the people and hear what they were saying. And one of these people, James McCord, was actually the head of the security for the Republican Party. The Nixon campaign denied anything involving them. They said that they didn't know anything about it, they didn't see what had happened, they didn't know. But the Washington Post continued to investigate President Nixon and his investigation. So they were able to keep using their newspaper to keep the story in the public consciousness until Nixon ended up resigning. So the break in was eventually tied to President Nixon and his reelection campaign through a $25,000 check that a Republican donor had laundered. So they found out that Nixon's committee, that was actually called CREEP, the Committee to Reelect the President, CREEP, CREEP, they actually controlled a secret fund for political espionage. They didn't even really need to do that. As you can see in this election here, President Nixon won pretty much by a landslide in 1972. So he had done a great job in that election. They did not need to go to these lengths to try to sabotage the Democratic Party. So they did investigate in March of 1973. They did confirm that it was a conspiracy, and the Senate began an investigation in May of 1973. These hearings were televised. They focused on when the president knew about the break in. And in June of 1973, the testimony, the different interviews they were getting from people really implicated President Nixon from the earliest days of the Watergate scandal. They said that he had known all along about their plans to break in and sabotage the Democratic Party. So, the former White House aide Alexander Butterfield was asked about the source of the White House information. He revealed the existence of an automatic taping system that Nixon had actually secretly installed in the Oval Office. The Oval Office is where the president works. So, that meant every conversation that anyone had had in the Oval Office had been recorded. And these tapes now would become the focus of the investigation. So the Supreme Court ordered President Nixon to surrender the tapes. These became known as the smoking gun. So kind of like the last straw, what pointed everything towards Nixon. In the tapes, they found that Nixon had been involved from the earliest days. He had authorized hush money to try to cover it up. He tried to get the CIA to interfere with the FBI investigation. These were known as smoking gun tapes. They were released in 1974. And the House Judiciary Committee approved articles of impeachment against President Nixon. So they were going to send this to the whole House in order to impeach the president. The president tried to go ahead and fire people who he thought would get him prosecuted, who would get him removed from office. This became known as the Saturday Night Massacre, where he was firing people. And Nixon, now at the end of his rope, knew he was caught. He knew that he was going to be impeached by the House of Representatives and then removed from office by the Senate. So he decided instead of doing that, he was just going to go ahead and quit. So on July 27, 1974, the House approved those articles of impeachment against him. And then on August 5th of 1974, that smoking gun tape became public to the nation. And then just 4 days later, August 9th, 1974, Richard Nixon would become the first American president to resign. So he actually quit the job of the presidency. So overall, over 30 government officials ended up going to prison for their role in the Watergate scandal. President Nixon was not one of them because after President Nixon quit, he could have been charged with these crimes, but his vice president, this guy Gerald Ford, who would then become president after the president quit, he gave President Nixon a full pardon, which means he could not be in trouble for any of those crimes. And he resigns. Richard Nixon, first American president to resign. So, Gerald Ford becomes our next president, president number 38. He will serve from 1974 to 1977. He was actually the first person who was ever our president who was not elected either as the president or as the vice president. So, President Nixon's first vice president actually resigned. His vice president quit, so he was able to appoint Gerald Ford to be his new vice president. And then when Nixon quit, Gerald Ford then became president. So he is our only he is our only president to never be elected as either vice president or president. All right, and that's the end of your notes for today. So don't forget to write a summary, what it is about what you learned today.